waiting for the last few people to join here, and then we'll get started. Perhaps you can hear the chapel bells in the background. Are we good to go?
Give me 1 minute.
Okay. Oh, yeah, welcome. Another 5 to 10 seconds, and then you can go ahead and grab a seat wherever you go. Okay. Well, everyone, whether you're here in this room or wherever you are around the world, thank you so much for joining us today. Hello from Berkeley, from the German Historical Institute's Pacific Regional Office out here in California. My name is Robin Buller. I'm one of the tandem postdoctoral fellows here in Berkeley, and I'm very pleased to be moderating today's talk and to welcome Professor Kevin Ostoyich. He is a professor of history and recipient of the Dixon W and Herta E Benz Fund for faculty support at Valparaiso University in Indiana. And here at the GHI PRO, he is the senior faculty fellow. And today he is going to be speaking with us about his research and giving us a talk called No Birthday Party This Year, Kristallnacht Within the Memories of Shanghai Jewish Refugees. So, welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much. The top right window, stormtroopers, the night, November 9th to 10th, 1938, threw a brick through that window. On the other side of that window lay the 6-month-old Harry J. Abraham. The shards of glass fell on him. This was the first house attacked by the stormtroopers in Frickhofen, Germany, a little village. After attacking the house of the Abraham family, the stormtroopers continued going down the street, turning a corner, and these two houses were next. Jewish families lived in these two houses, and they were then attacked on Kristallnacht. After this, the stormtroopers continued to the next building. This residential house, what it looks like today, used to have the synagogue of the village of Frickhofen. The stormtroopers did not burn down the building, but instead ransacked it. What was going to happen to the Abraham family? What was happening in a neighboring town of Altenkirchen was also affecting the Abraham family. Ida Abraham, Harry J. Abraham's mother, had her husband in Altenkirchen because he was a cattle trader. He was from Altenkirchen and he was there doing business. He was rounded up in Altenkirchen and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. Meanwhile, Ida's brother was also apprehended and also sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. So we should think that today is November 10th, 2021. But if you go back to November 9th, 10th, 1938, we find that families like the Abrahams had their lives overturned overnight. What was Ida Abraham going to do? Her husband did not come home. Her brother was apprehended. Her infant son just had glass from a brick through a window fall upon him. She did not know what was in store. Her situation was replicated all throughout Germany and Austria. As stormtroopers were going to villages like Frickhofen, to towns like Altenkirchen, going to synagogues like this one, destroying the Jewish presence in Germany. The SS, the SA members were from a neighboring town. They weren't from Frickhofen. The SS and SA from Frickhofen were, on the night of November 9th and 10th, they were in a neighboring town doing the same. What was going to happen to Ida Abraham and her 6-month-old child? Well, the Nazis didn't want to just destroy the synagogue. They didn't want to just destroy houses. They also wanted to destroy the society. They wanted to make sure that the people of Frickhofen did not even associate or even provide food to the Abraham family. And thus Ida went out onto the street saying, "How am I going to feed my baby? Who will give me milk for my Harry?" Eventually, one woman in Frickhofen decided to go against the grain and secretly provided milk to Ida for her young Harry. Now that she had established food for her child, the most important task, she then turned to thoughts about her husband and brother, Albrecht and Siegfried, and said, "How am I going to get them out?" Well, she turned to her father. Her father was a prominent member of the town. He had been in the Navy, fought in the First World War, and he had heard about a place all the way on the other side of the world that could be a place for refugees. And Ida started to get the documentation that she would need to get her husband, Albrecht, to get her brother, Siegfried, out of Buchenwald concentration camp and somehow on a train to Italy, somehow on a boat to Shanghai, because life for the Abrahams was no longer going to happen in Germany. Documentation. Ida had to go and try to find the documentation to get her and her family out of Frickhofen, out Germany. What did she need to do? She needed to travel. She needed to go back and forth, one bureaucratic official after the other, to try to get the information, get the documentation that she would need to get her brother, her husband, herself, her child, and hopefully her parents as well, out of Germany. This was not an easy thing. But as Harry J. Abraham told me in an interview in 2017, my mother was a determined woman, and she was going to find a way. And she did. She had first to go and get assurances, not the tickets, but actual assurances from a shipping line that they would transport Siegfried and Albrecht out. With those assurances, she was able to go to those bureaucratic officials, thus was able to get the release of her husband and her brother. However, once they were released, those shipping lines started to act on her vulnerability, saying, now we're going to raise the prices. She didn't know what to do. She turned again to her father, and her father started to use pressure with non-Jewish friends to put pressure on those shipping lines to honor their word. And finally, they did. This here is Ida Abraham's passport. You will see no longer was her name Ida Abraham. It was now officially to the Nazi world, Ida Sarah Abraham. If we turn to the next slide, we see the documentation for the young Harry J. Abraham, the child who was in that right window when that brick came through the night of November 9th, 10th. Now with the documentation, now with the destination, the thought was Ida, Harry, and Ida's parents were going to follow Albrecht and Siegfried to Shanghai. After getting all the documentation, her parents said, we're not going. We're not going. As Harry J. Abraham said, his mother never got over the fact that she had gotten the tickets, all the documentation, and yet her parents stayed in Frickhofen. They did not go to Shanghai. Her father would die on an operating room table after being put to hard labor by the Nazis and had a burst appendix. Her mother had to hide in one of the other houses on the street in Frickhofen, hide with other Jewish women. But then eventually they were found and sent to Auschwitz. J passports. J, the red J for Jude, Jew. This passport is not from the Abraham family. It's from a different family. Not in Frickhofen, not in Altenkirchen, but probably a place you've heard of, Berlin. This is the J passport of one Horst Katz, the older brother of Harry Katz. I'm going to talk to you today about Harry Katz and, as you know, Harry J. Abraham. Two different Harrys whose lives were overturned by Kristallnacht. What was happening on this date in 1938, November 10th, 1938, the morning, Julius Katz was out of the house having a shave and a haircut. Meanwhile, his three older children, Hans, Horst, and Ilse, were at school, leaving Frieda, his wife, and the young 5-year-old Harry Katz home alone when they heard the knocking of the Gestapo and they were told, "Where is your husband?" "He's not here." "That's good. Tell him not to come back." "Not to come back? What's going on?" Well, it turns out that Julius Katz was actually friends with some of the SS men. He was friends with the policemen because Julius Katz, just like Ida Abraham's father, had been a veteran in the First World War. The Katz family in Berlin actually lived above the SS headquarters. Every Friday night, Julius Katz would play cards with members of the SS as well as policemen from across the street. That is what bought the Katz family some time. That is what gave them that courtesy of when the men came up, they said, "Where is your husband? He's out. Don't let him back. We're going to give you some time. Get your belongings together. Get out of here. We will lock up the place and we'll tell you when you can come back." That is what the friendships, all of the card playing, bought the Katz family. What did this event mean to Harry Katz at 5 years old? As he revealed to me in 2017 when I sat across from him, he said all it meant was there was going to be no birthday party for me this year. Harry was born on March 4th, 1933. After Kristallnacht, there was nothing to celebrate, as the family had to figure out what was going to happen. As Julius, who was a trader in terms of chocolates, to be a salesman for chocolates, he had to try now to figure out how to come up with passage for he, his wife, and 4 children, 3 boys, 1 girl. Harry Katz was too young. He was 5 years old. He doesn't know how, but he knows that his father did the best that he could, and they couldn't all go together. Julius was able to get passage, 2 different sets of passage, 1 for 1 person, and then 1 for 3 people. Meanwhile, the family had cousins in England and was able to get Horst on a kinder transport. And the eldest, Hans, was going to go to Palestine. That was the best that Julius could do. So Hans was going to set out to Palestine. Unfortunately for Hans, he only made it to Cologne, where he was apprehended. He was sent back. Eventually, 1942, he was sent to Auschwitz and killed. What happened to Julius? Julius went with the 2 youngest children, Ilse and Harry, first in a train to Genoa, and then in Genoa, a ship to Shanghai. Meanwhile, Frida went also to Shanghai, but by herself. That was the best that Julius could do. But look at this J passport, and this passport is of Horst, who was 7 years older than Harry, and was supposed to go to England. I say supposed to go to England because somehow, at age 12, Horst Katz decided he wasn't going to be separated from his parents. And he got himself off of the kinder transport. And somehow, Harry does not know how his older brother did this, somehow at that young age was able to get the documentation changed, and he got himself to Shanghai by himself. What happened to Horst when he arrived? He contracted polio. What happened to Ilse when she arrived in Shanghai? She contracted polio as well. For Horst, we see this picture here. Once he arrived in Shanghai, he contracted polio, severe case of polio. He had to spend the next 2 years in a hospital. And as Harry recalled to me in 2017, the primitive nature of medicine at the time, his brother was simply hung out a window, hoping that it would straighten his spine. His sister Ilse had a milder case. She was given a metal corset. Whereas Harry and this will become a refrain in his life, was the lucky one. Nothing happened to him. As he said, he kind of skated through life, the youngest and the luckiest. Here is documentation of Harry Katz. So this is our first picture of Harry Katz. Documentation in Shanghai. Both the Abraham family as well as the Katz family arrived in Shanghai with nothing. Let me talk a little bit about Shanghai. Some of you may not know of Shanghai as being a place of refuge during the Holocaust, but it was for somewhere between 16 and 20,000 people, like the Abrahams, like the Katz family. Shanghai was a destination not of choice, but it was a destination of necessity because it did not require an entry visa for people to get off the boat and to move into Shanghai. That's the only reason. It wasn't for adventure. It wasn't for study abroad. It wasn't for any of those reasons that people go to China today. It was because of necessity and because when the Jews of the world were being discriminated against and persecuted, the countries of the world, the sovereign countries of the world, closed their doors. So Shanghai it was for the Abraham family. Shanghai it was for the Katz family. What was it like for boys in Shanghai? Well, for Harry, Abraham, he doesn't remember much in the beginning, of course. He was still very young, but he does remember then going to the Freisinger school. He remembers going to where the Mir Yeshiva was for Hebrew school. Interestingly enough, Harry Katz also attended the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai, although he was quite a bit older than Harry, but who knows, maybe they would have been there at the same time. Harry Katz was very active in Shanghai. His documents, this is a copy, which is now at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He has many of these. In this case, third place for Harry Katz in the ping pong league. This became a lifelong love of Harry Katz, ping pong, which was actually quite common amongst many of the boys in Shanghai. We also have a first place chess. He was very good in chess. Not as good in shot put, 11th place, but we see that he was diversified in his activities in Shanghai. This is something that may be of interest to you as I'm wearing this item, and so many of you are, and many of you are zooming in. Disease isn't something invented for our pleasure in 2020 and 2021. What we have here are inoculation documents from April 1949, and that is Frida, the top, okay, and that is Harry Katz, the bottom. Well, by this time, tragedy had struck the Katz family again. Harry Katz was due to be bar mitzvahed in March of 1946, but his father, Julius, who had got the family to Shanghai in those various ways, had cancer. And Harry Katz, when he explained it to me, at a time when he himself had terminal cancer, said, my father, I can explain it no other way, my father willed himself to live to see me bar mitzvah. It was very important for him. He was bar mitzvahed in the morning. That evening, his father went into a coma and he died the next day. What did this mean for the status of the family as they're getting their inoculation shots and their documentation? It meant that now they were no longer under the Polish quota, because yes, those doors were still closed on the Jews after 1945. This is a part of the Shanghai story that gets kind of swept under the rug. The many years that the Jews had to stay in Shanghai because of all of the bureaucratic obstacles that were still in their way, still in the way of people who were born in Posen, as Julius Katz was. Because now they're under the Polish quota, and the United States did not want any Poles. The quota was very restricted. When he died, it was even worse for the family, because you'll see Frida here on the top of your screen. Frida was born in now what was considered the Soviet Union. And let me welcome you all to a little thing called the Cold War. And thus, the family had almost no prospects of making it to the United States. Horst, who is now 21 years old, the second he turned 21, he was no longer considered to be Polish, no longer considered to be a Soviet. He was now under the German quota, and thus Horst could go by himself. And he set up shop in Chicago. It wasn't until 1949, if you look at the documentation there, 1949, you'll see it isn't until 1949 that Frida, Ilse, and Harry are able to follow Horst to the United States. And where do they arrive? I'm standing here in the Bay Area. They arrived in San Francisco. Harry, you see him there. He saved up $5. Saved up $5 for the trip. First, they stopped in Honolulu. And he decided if he ever had more than $5, he was going to retire in Hawaii. He loved it. Harry's not alone. But also, he was able to use $2 of those dollars to buy a Swiss Army knife. And he thought he was really great now. He was able to, he had $3 left. What was he going to do? Okay, well, on the SS President Wilson, the family was going to the United States. And on that ship, Harry started to put to use all of those activities that he learned in Shanghai: ping pong, badminton, shuffleboard, all of these. And he entered himself into a contest, and he won the first prize. This was a prized possession of Harry Katz throughout all of his life. It is not made of gold. If you were trying to sell this, it would not bring in the big bucks. But it was priceless to Harry Katz because it symbolized that he was a survivor. He had won. And he still had some money left. So what did he do? When he got to San Francisco, and people in this room will know this, Market Street, he strolled down Market Street and he said it was spring, it was cherries season, and he spent 13 cents for a pound of cherries, okay? If we were to go to the Monterey Market, people around here know that it's a little bit more expensive than 13 cents a pound, but he felt like he was on top of the world, walking through Market Street with his cherries, and he had just won this cup. But if you ask Harry Katz about Shanghai, and if that's all you ask him about, he's going to say, you know, you're missing my life. And this is something that we need to remember about Shanghai Jewish refugees. They are not to be defined simply by the Shanghai experience. When I thought that I had done my job interviewing Harry Katz, I said, which is a good rule of thumb, I always end my interviews this way, and I'm glad I did that time. I said, is there anything I haven't asked you about? And he said, you know, Kevin, we haven't really talked about what I find most important about my life. And I said, really? He said, yeah, Shanghai wasn't what was most important about my life. What was most important about my life was my service to my new country and my service in Korea. And here we see Harry on the right, always with the ping pong, but now serving in the United States, not as a citizen yet, but in 1954 in Hakata, Japan, as he was doing some R&R during his service in Korea, Harry Katz finally had citizenship. Something that maybe we take for granted. Definitely not something that Harry Katz took for granted. And it's also something that Harry J. Abraham takes for granted. He is pictured here toward the end of his time in Shanghai. Like Harry Katz, Harry J. Abraham arrived in San Francisco, and he went to Pittsburgh, and then eventually the Abraham family, Julius, was able to get a position in Cleveland. And it's in the Cleveland area that Harry J. Abraham lives today. Harry J. Abraham doesn't really want you to focus much on Shanghai. And I'm actually not focusing much on Shanghai in this talk. He wants you to not get lost in the details of Shanghai and just be overwhelmed by the experience of Shanghai. He wants you to go back to Kristallnacht, that day that we are commemorating today, the 9th to 10th, 1938. He wants you to go back the way he went back. This is him in Altenkirchen. This was the town in which his father, Albrecht, was rounded up on Kristallnacht. And he wants us to not get lost in the details. He wants us to focus on why Shanghai happened. And according to Harry J. Abraham, it is because no one stood up. No one did anything when the Jews were persecuted on Kristallnacht. Not just other Germans, but also the other countries of the world that did when the Nazis came knocking on the doors of the Katz family, when they threw bricks through windows like the Abraham family. And here is Harry J. Abraham looking at the past, looking at the tombstones of his ancestors, and he wants to make sure that the Germans always preserve and keep these cemeteries clean, manicured, because he wants them to remember the Jews that lived amongst them. When you talk to Harry J. Abraham today, he is a man who very much values the past. He puts you on your toes. I was tested by Harry J. Abraham. He said, "Why do you want to know about Shanghai?" And it was clear he was testing me. And if I failed this test, he wasn't going to tell me about Shanghai, because he wanted to know, what am I after? And he revealed to me that day the importance of Kristallnacht, the importance of asking questions to this history. It's not enough to know about the Holocaust. It's not enough to know all the details of Shanghai. If you know all those details and never ask why Shanghai became a place of refuge and why Kristallnacht happened and no one did anything about it, then he thinks it's all a waste of time. And he says Shanghai ultimately is really insignificant in world history. He said, what was it, 16 to 20,000 people? However, what is significant is the question behind it. Why is it that people look the other way when they encounter injustice? That is a question that Harry J. Abraham asked to the friends of Albrecht Abraham when he went back to Altenkirchen and was being interviewed by a newspaper. And he said, well, if you're going to ask me questions, I want to ask you questions. He goes, all of you who are here, you say you were my father's best friend. The guy said, yes. He said, I knew him as a Jew, but he was my best friend. He goes, okay, then what did you do about it? You say he was your best friend, but what did you do? And he said, they started to cry. And he said, well, if you're going to ask me questions, you need to answer the questions that I have for you as well. Harry J. Abraham wants us all to be asking ourselves those questions. When we encounter discrimination, what do we do today? Harry wants us to return to Kristallnacht, the way his congregation in the Cleveland area does, and he's very passionate about keeping the memory about Kristallnacht alive. And what about Harry Katz. Unfortunately, Harry Katz is no longer with us. But I thought I'd end today by showing you what he's most proud of, not a picture of Shanghai. If you want to understand Harry Katz's life, Shanghai only plays a small part. And if you want to know what he was really proud of, it's that uniform. But when Harry thought back to his life, although he was a winner, winning trophies everywhere he went, he started to think, why was I so lucky? Why was it me that won all the awards? Why did I get through all of this? Why was it my older brother who died in Auschwitz? Why was it my second brother who, right when he thought he had made it out, contracted polio which eventually took his life? Why was it that his mother was scarred by the fact that she wasn't there when Horst died and blamed herself? Why was it that Ilse contracted polio? Why was it that Harry was the lucky one? This is something we have to tackle as historians, that sometimes survival flips itself into survivor's guilt. And Harry Katz felt that until his wife, Audrey, told him, it's not your fault. You have to start living your life. Harry Katz, when I interviewed him, had terminal cancer. And yet he told jokes. And it turned out Harry Katz was a very funny man. And thus, I want to end with two positive things about Harry Katz's life. First is, he would be very mad if I didn't talk about his most prized possession, even more so than that cup, which was his diehard Cub fan. He wore this always in his wallet since 1949. You see that on the right part of the screen. It's because after going from Shanghai to Honolulu to San Francisco, he then went to Chicago following Horst. And they stayed in the Jackson Hotel, and they turned on a television, 1949, in their hotel room, and lo and behold, the Chicago Cubs were playing. And I think Harry Katz willed himself to live to see the Chicago Cubs win the World Series, one of the proudest moments of his whole life. And I will leave you with, you're probably not expecting a joke during a talk on Kristallnacht, but this is about Harry Katz. Here is a joke that I heard Harry Katz tell. And to understand Harry Katz, when he was a boy, he would sneak in Shanghai to the performances of comedians performing to the adults. And he'd learn their shtick. And then the next day he would try out the jokes on the kids. They didn't understand them, but the parents around would laugh. Here's a joke that he told about his impending fate. First of all, he said, I have lived my retirement years in Pebble Beach, and if anything prepares one for heaven, living in Pebble Beach is something that prepares you. The second, he says, two things can happen to people in life. They can be healthy, or they can be sick. He said, well, if you're healthy, you've got nothing to worry about. If you're sick, well, then two things can happen. You can get better, or you can get worse. If you get better, you've got nothing to worry about. If you get worse, two things can happen. First is you live. The second is you die. If you live, you've got nothing to worry about. If you die, two things can happen to you. Either you go to heaven or you go to hell. If you go to heaven, you've got nothing to worry about. If you go to hell, you'll be too busy shaking hands with everyone you knew. You won't have any time to be worried. Thank you very much.
making the chat big so that we can see it over here. Thanks so much. Thank you, Professor Ostoyich. That was a fantastic talk. We have time for some questions, and I know that some folks already have begun to use the chat. We're going to ask that if you have any questions to please type them into the chat, and I'm going to read them out for Professor Ostoyich, and
I'll do my best.
you'll do your best
I will
to
do my
answer
best.
them. Okay, and so I'm gonna have to walk a little bit this way in order
You
to
read
read
them?
questions. Sorry, aging eyes. Okay, so we've got some excellent sort of chatter going on right now still. Waiting on some questions. Maybe Anna.
Yeah.
Yes, please. We have questions in real life
Yeah.
at this hybrid event.
Yeah.
Okay, so Anna, another one of our postdocs has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. You focused today on Jews from Germany, but during the war, I know during my own research that also a lot of Jews from Poland fled to Shanghai.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you are also doing research on Jews from Poland, and if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And the other question is that in Shanghai, then various Jewish refugee migrant groups were situated, and I was wondering if they interacted with each other, how did they perceive each other, because from my research on Polish Jews, I know that there were also a lot of Yiddish activism going on in Shanghai during that time. Yeah, and I was just wondering if you probably know, because you probably know a lot of this.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah. The first question about the Polish refugees. There were about 2,000 Polish refugees who came later.
Yeah.
Right. They were very much the last of the refugees to get to Shanghai, and they went through Poland, through Lithuania, and this is there's a famous story of the Japanese official Sugihara, who issued visas. And actually, there's an attempt to now try to collect all of those visas all over the world. And they then went to Japan and were in Kobe, Japan, and then went from Kobe, Japan to Shanghai. I have not interviewed anyone from the Polish community. I know Haya Small, met her on numerous occasions through the Florence and Lawrence Spungen Family Foundation. And what I want to do is recommend a book, which is Vera Schwartz's In the Crook of the Rock, which is a beautiful oral testimony with Haya Small, and you get a very rich portrait of that community. That community was very much removed in many ways, culturally, linguistically, but also in terms of religious practice from the German and Austrian and Czech. There were also a small number of Czech Jewish refugees. There were a lot of divisions there that between those communities. So there was little interaction, and there was interaction in both of these individuals, however, Harry Katz and Harry Abraham, as I said, that both of them interacted with the Mir Yeshiva. The Mir Yeshiva was a teaching unit, a school that was preserved because the Mir Yeshiva went almost in its entirety to Shanghai, and they provided religious instruction. And both Harry and Harry had instruction.
I'm watching a show.
The second question is
If you've unmuted yourself, please just make sure that your microphone is muted to the guests. Thank you.
Yeah, the second question, we have to remember that there were multiple Jewish communities in Shanghai, and that the refugees were not the first. This goes back to the mid-19th century with the influx of the opium trade, and Baghdadi Jews also through India coming as Sephardic community. That community is the community that is associated with the skyscrapers of the Bund and the banking institutions and names like Kadoorie, Hardoon, and Sassoon. That community stayed, but then there's also a Russian community, which came the end of the 19th century, but then into the years of the 20th century, either because of pogroms or due to the revolutions in 1917 or the Civil War after. And most of them went through Harbin and then came from Harbin into Shanghai. That community, but then we have the Austrians, because this doesn't start with Kristallnacht. It actually starts for the Austrians with the Anschluss. So we have the Austrian Jews, then they are then overtaken in terms of numbers by the German Jews. Those communities still remained very much intact. There was some porous nature in terms of some of the interactions between those communities, but because of cultural differences, you talked about Yiddish. Many of the people that I interviewed, their families didn't speak Yiddish, so that wasn't something that they could understand. So those divisions did stay. But one place in which children did interact was in what was called the Shanghai Jewish School, which was set up and had mostly stateless Russian Jews, but there were some refugees. So I've actually interviewed, for example, I've interviewed a man and a woman. He was a stateless Russian Jew. He lives in New Jersey, and a woman who was from the German refugee community. And when they sat behind the other in school. So there was some interaction there, and they became lifelong friends. Although she didn't like the fact that he sat behind her and would take her braids and dunk them into his ink. But I think she forgave him.
Thank you. Yes, please. And if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Adams. I'm a sociologist here at the Centre for Jewish Studies. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you about what questions you're looking into, what you're examining with your research on Jews in Shanghai, if you'd be willing to share that.
Sure. First of all, I like to explore, as you can see, I like to explore lives before Shanghai and after Shanghai. And I feel that a lot of times people get kind of labeled or reduced to their Shanghai experience. So I like to see how the whole life is lived. And in the case of Harry Katz, you find out the Shanghai questions aren't the real questions to be asking, right? That provides the background to what is really his life. And his life was about service in the United States, right? And that, I think, it's lost somehow, because we come to these questions, we come to individuals with questions maybe from our research or what we think we're going to be asking. But for me, it's listening to find out what are the real questions that get to the person and to kind of reveal that person's life. And that means really not questions, but listen and kind of find, and it's more of a reactive interaction. And for me, it's a learning process. I didn't go in to ask Harry Abraham, what did he think about Kristallnacht? I came out of that conversation by asking myself, what do I think about Kristallnacht? And that's what I mean. It becomes I'm not the one controlling the situation with my questions. I'm the one who is maybe creating a space, and then those questions come out. And for me, that was a transformative experience. And it wasn't on my notepad, but it's now informed all of what I do. Those questions that Harry J. Abraham posed to me. But I do think there are more questions that need to be asked. In particular, we need to be asking what was the experience of ordinary Chinese in the area? What was the experience of the Japanese there? So much of what we know is from the Jewish perspective. And that's very important and vitally important, but it's also limited because it's limited to the Jewish experience. What we need is more scholars asking questions about other communities and seeing the broader context. Also, I think we need to be asking more questions about the period between 1945 and 1949. We have a lot of the experience in the designated area. We have a lot of experience in the 1938 to 1945 period. But we need to be asking the tough questions about why was it so difficult for Jews to then get to Australia, to go to the United States after the war, right? Those are some of the questions that I think, not just me, but I think others need to be asking.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to ask one of the questions in the chat, and then we'll come on to Zoran, just because this is, I think, related to the previous question and a question that I had. So Joe Goldblatt says, hello from Edinburgh. And he asks, why was Shanghai so inconsequential to people like Harry Katz? And what do you as the historian, then step out and believe was the significance of Shanghai in the narrative, even if they don't think it was important? That's a question I have too.
Yeah, of course it's vitally important, but it's all about, I think, maybe the questions that we don't ask. So I believe that we need, for example, with Harry J. Abraham, yes, it's important to know about Shanghai, but for Harry, it's about if you spend your whole in basically telling me, if you spend your whole career figuring out every nook and cranny of the Shanghai experience without ever asking these fundamental questions about why this happened, he'd say it's pretty much a waste of time, right? We should be demanding of ourselves that we ask those fundamental questions about humanity. Why humanity allows for a Holocaust to happen? Why does humanity? Why did the best friends of Albrecht Abraham look the other way? If you're really that person's best friend and you see them being carted away, what is the proper response? And that's really what Harry really demanded that answer. Not just of those people, but he demands it for all of us. So I think it's, yes, significant to understand the details, but we have to be asking the questions about why these things happen. It's not just about how and descriptive. It has to be about why these things happen and why we continue to do these things today. I hope that's an acceptable answer, Joe. So.
Right. We have a question from our live audience as well. So Zoran.
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin, for this great talk and this snapshot into Jewish life in Shanghai during the war and after the war. I actually have two questions. The first is in relation to the Japanese. I mean, you mentioned them already. Shanghai was occupied by the Japanese, and the Japanese were the German, like part of the Axis or ally of the Germans. So what was their policy? Like, what was their policy towards the Japanese? The Chinese, obviously, they could enter Shanghai without an entry visa, but still, they were under the control of the German allies. So what was the policy of the Japanese towards the Jews, and maybe also towards the different groups of Jews, the Russian Jews who came from Harbin versus the Polish and the German Jews? And then the second question, I don't know a little about the German community there, but I know a very prominent figure, namely Klaus Mehnert, who is a German, but not a Jew, who was during the war years in Shanghai. He was running the 20th century. He was the editor. It's a English-speaking propaganda journal of the German foreign ministry in East Asia at that time. So there were Germans who were not Jews in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. So how did they interact with each other?
Excellent. Well, I'll start with that. There's a scholar I'm going to plug by the name of Christian Spang, who actually is a German scholar who teaches in Tokyo. And he's doing research on exactly what you're asking in terms of what was the German community like in Shanghai. And I don't want to scoop his research, but because I have an inside look at some of his research that's going to come out, which is that he finds that there's a vast difference between the German community in Shanghai with the German community in Tokyo, and that there's more room for more neutrality amongst the German community in Shanghai vis-a-vis Tokyo, where there's definitely more pressure. So that's something that's very interesting. He's actually seeing some interaction where German non-Jewish Germans are actually going to Jewish stores, and they actually say, well, where else am I going to get good sausages, right? So there's and then you have some Germans who are watching that, taking photos, right, spying and saying, well, that's unerlaubt, right? So there's some of that going on. That, I think, is a community that needs a lot more research to try to figure out the German community. Please remind me the first question.
The Japanese.
The Japanese, yes, so the Japanese, again, is a community that needs more research. And the problem there is that Japanese scholars are not working on it. This is the major hole in our knowledge. And there's, I'm going to plug another scholar because he's working on it. His name is Kenji Kano. And he is a Japanese scholar in Tokyo who is going and finding documents to start answer our questions about the Japanese, who until up to this point have been kind of faceless and have been reduced to one official by the name of Kano Goya. And we know that one person doesn't represent everyone. But unfortunately, in the narrative up to this point, they have. Now, you asked specifically about the relationship between the Germans and the Japanese in Shanghai. And that has been that's kind of plagued our minds throughout with respect to this historiography. To what extent did the Japanese do? What did they do? Did they do it because they were doing it on their own initiative? Were they doing it because they were allies of the Germans? It seems that the best answer to this right now is that the Japanese were doing what they wanted to do in Shanghai because they wanted to do it. And the Germans did not have really any real power chips in Shanghai. There has been this whole idea that a colonel who was known as the Butcher of Warsaw, Joseph Meisinger, that he wanted the Japanese to kill all the Jews in Shanghai. There have been books written about this and so forth, but we're not sure exactly what the facts are there. But everything seems to lead that the Japanese were doing what the Japanese were doing in Shanghai because the Japanese wanted to do what they were doing in Shanghai. They saw it as part of their sphere of influence and did not take the cues from the Germans. What was the policy towards the other communities? It changed over time. So the Japanese had set up in the northern part of the international settlement, and that was kind of their sphere of influence. And what we forget is that they were fighting the Chinese prior to this, right? And that a lot of that was going on outside of the city, and it came into the city. So a lot of the refugees actually came into a bombed out part of the city because it was bombed out due to the war between the Japanese and the Chinese. Meanwhile, the city was still very much a colonial city, being run by a Shanghai Municipal Council in which the British and the Americans were the most powerful forces, and the Japanese are kind of biding their time. Meanwhile, if you go south of the international settlement, you have the French concession. So the French had their own, basically, colony in Shanghai. This changes in December of 1941, not only with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there's also bombing that happens in the Bund area. And that changes things, specifically with the Sephardic community, the ones that had built the skyscrapers, the Sassoons and so forth. It changed overnight for them because most of them were British citizens, now technically enemy combatants. That's the group that eventually, it doesn't happen overnight, but it eventually happens where they are put into internment camps. And those of you who are watching through Zoom, if you know of the Steven Spielberg film called Empire of the Sun, some of the younger ones amongst you may know Christian Bale, right? Batman. Well, this was his first film. This tells the experience of those who were interned, the British and Americans, and amongst them were Sephardic Jews. And there's a woman who lives in Los Angeles by the name of Esther Schifrin, who goes all over the country, perhaps the world, telling her story of being interned as a child as a Sephardic Jew. What did it mean for the stateless Russian Jews? Not much in comparison, because they had arrived in the country before January 1st, 1937. And when the Japanese set up the designated area in 1943, it was specified that only stateless persons who entered after January 1st, 1937, had to go into the designated area. So the stateless Russian Jews, it did not apply. And if you want to read a wonderful memoir, I'm plugging everybody today, but if you want to read a wonderful memoir that captures the experience of a stateless Russian Jew who was living in the French concession and remembered when the refugees came. Her name is Lillian Willens. She also speaks. So contact Lillian Willens and read her book, Stateless in Shanghai. I hope that answers the two questions in the few parts to each one.
I think we are I think we've gone a little bit over time anyways, but there are two more questions. So I'll just maybe quickly ask those together. And then folks who need to leave, we thank you very much for coming. So two more quick questions, and I'm going to combine them. Yarwu asks if you can speak on, this is something I'm not familiar with, but the Fugu plan.
Oh, the Fugu plan,
And
yes.
then the second question, we'll just sort of combine these for the sake of time, is whether there are any statistics of the percentage of the 20 or so thousand Jewish refugees that went to Shanghai who remained in China.
Oh, okay. First, the Fugu plan. The Fugu plan was this, basically the Fugu fish is a poisonous fish, but if you prepare it wrong, it's not good for you because it's a poisonous fish, okay? So if you prepare it wrong, bad. If you prepare it correctly, it's supposed to be a delicacy. And what the Fugu plan was apparently how the Japanese saw the Jews, and they saw it very much in a kind of anti-Semitic lens, that the Jewish people were powerful, and but if they were treated the right way, the way one prepares a Fugu fish, then you take away that poison, and you can actually have a very good experience. So the belief was that this was guiding Japanese policy to kind of hold the Jews kind of hostage, trying to use the Jews, thinking that the Jews had power in the United States and so forth. So this is referred to as the Fugu plan. But I still think that the jury is still out in terms of understanding exactly what was behind Japanese policy. Another book that I'll plug is by Gao Bei. It came out in 2013. It's called Shanghai Sanctuary, in which she actively tries to compare kind of the Chinese government's view towards the Jews as well as the Japanese towards the Jews. The second question was
the percentage you
the percentage who remained. We're getting close to zero, folks, because first of all, Shanghai was seen not as a place of permanent residence. This is not where people wanted to stay. Most people wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. They only stayed because other places wouldn't let them in, like the United States, based on, we talked about Harry Katz's family, whether they were Polish or whether they were Soviet or whether they were German dependent. And then in 1949, the communists defeated the nationalists. And basically what we have in that whole period from 1945 to 1949 is something very important, in that the Chinese themselves are retaking their country, right? And they're reestablishing national sovereignty. Remember, they didn't have sovereignty over Shanghai since the first Opium War, right? So back to the mid-19th century. So they're establishing their sovereignty, and in that process are seeing kind of they don't necessarily see Jewish and non-Jewish, they see Westerner, and they see colonialist, and they see this should be our country, we should have sovereignty over it. And then when the communists take over in the spring in Shanghai, but then October 1st, 1949, they're establishing the country for the Chinese, and a movement that has already been starting since 1945, picking up in 1946. By the time we get to 1949, and we have the people like the Katzes who are really in the last hundreds out of the thousands. You really aren't going to have many, and they're just maybe a couple hundred into the 1950s. And Faith Goldman, you're out there, I know it. You would be mad if I didn't mention this. Robert Goldman is the person who stayed longer than anyone that I've ever encountered. And I learned this from the wonderful Faith Goldman, who was dedicated to telling her husband's story, her late husband's story. But Robert Goldman was in Shanghai until 1958, a full 9 years after just about anyone else. And it's not because Robert Goldman wanted to be there, it was because of his father had mental problems and became paranoid and basically kept his son kind of prisoner in Shanghai. But that story kind of tells, it's like being alone in Shanghai. Fascinating. So Faith Goldman, hello. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that those are all of our questions, and we've gone over, but we've started a little bit late, so we're probably at a perfect hour. So Professor Ostoyich, thank you so much. I'll let you,
Thank you.
say goodbye to
Yes, goodbye.
your
Thank you,
audience.
all of you who have joined from the world of Zoom. I hope that this little over an hour of your time was worth it. And for everyone here, thank you for being here. Also, my parents, who, if you didn't like this lecture, it's their fault. Robert Ostoyich and Janet Ostoyich, who are here. So thank you very much, Mom and Dad, for being here. And thank you to the GHI PRO and University of California, Berkeley, for putting up with this. So